So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. People can join in as they wish, but I'll give you a quick intro, Trey, if that's all right.
Sure.
We thank you for joining us with with this COVID-19 kind of IEI reporting, if you will. So we're having discussions on all different aspects of COVID-19. So we're bringing in experts to discuss the different angles of this really big elephant that has stepped into each and every one of our living rooms. So as far as Dr. Trey Malone is concerned, he's an expert in agriculture and food supply chains and beer, which is also really cool. He's an assistant professor and extension economist at Michigan State University. And he's extremely prolific in all aspects of agricultural economics, behavioral, and giving the behavioral component to a lot of this, a lot of agricultural and food economics, if you will. Published in several different journals, and works as a consultant, if I'm not mistaken, to a number of different firms in the industry, especially in the Michigan area. So we're looking forward to your insights. I know that with grocery stores being essential firms, and also kind of supply chains being disrupted quite dramatically with the pandemic, we're really looking forward to what you have to say. So I'll let you take it away from here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So let me see. Am I sharing my screen correctly here? Is that working?
You are.
Okay. So thank you very much, Kevin, for introducing me. For anybody that's on the call that doesn't know, Kevin and I actually published a paper on hemp. It feels like a million years ago now, but it was only like a year ago. That paper has actually been cited fairly well, and it's actually leading on to some other projects. So I really enjoy working with y'all's institute, and really am appreciative of getting the invite. So just before we kind of go too far down the road, I just want to highlight that this is like a very dynamic thing that's happening right now. So what we were talking about, even a week ago has changed so much that it really requires you to pay attention to know what's coming next. So what we've been doing is we've been hosting a live stream Q&A on Friday afternoons called Closing Bell. And so it's myself and then Alex Shaffer. Alex is our policy expert, ag policy expert here at Michigan State. He's got a JD from the University of Kansas with an emphasis in international trade, and a PhD from UC Davis with an emphasis in, well, actually infectious disease management was his dissertation. So this isn't quite, his dissertation was on infectious disease management in animals. There is a little bit of an overlap, but not quite as much as you might think. But we're learning on the fly here. So I've been very active on social media, trying to just get accurate content out. There's a lot of kind of confusion around what some of these, multi-state orders look like. So if you're interested and you want to kind of tune into what's going on our end and how things are changing, that's, I think, my plug for what we're doing. But to give you an idea of kind of who I am, so I'm a behavioral economist. Like Kevin said, I do ag, food, and drink marketing kind of broadly. So my dissertation was on the economics of beer, and I've done a fair bit on that. But I've published 23 articles. We'll have one coming out this week on politicization, how actually, if anything, Republicans and Democrats have converged towards statism in their food policy opinions from 2011 to 2017. But I've, like I said, I do a lot of research, but lately it's been a whole lot more outreach. So this was all last week, talking to different reporters and everything. And so I've been very engaged on this extension and outreach kind of cycle of my kind of model of how I developed my career. because I'm really trying to learn right now as quickly as possible how things are changing and what that means kind of down the road for consumers and for producers. So this is in Michigan, what was kind of the highlight, I'd say, for what happened. So I live less than a mile from this. There was even a horse, I guess, but there were all kinds of protests, and there was a lot of fear that was kind of cranking through, and in part, it's justified that we're in a really rough spot, but there is a fair amount of confusion on what these regulations look like, and also like even how we write these regulations, right? So as of right now, it's not abundantly clear to anybody how you decide that lottery tickets in Michigan can be sold, and yet Walmart can't sell garden plants. And so these lines that are being drawn has kind of led so Alex, myself, and then somebody who is actually a public health expert, Felicia Wu, to start writing a paper. It's an invited paper for a journal in Ag Econ, kind of about trying to understand how to understand this costs and benefits decision-making process for policymakers. So we're also working on some supply chain stuff with a task force out of Michigan State. And at least this is how we're thinking about it right now, that, as time progresses, disease prevention, the public health benefits associated with disease prevention actually increase because, the social value of a long-term procedure for social distancing, for example, has more value the longer we do it, if you want to think about it that way. While at the same time, the economic cost of a longer disease prevention model is a kind of significant loss. So I had a piece in USA Today that ran this morning about how it's quite possible that we're going to lose about half the breweries in the United States if things don't change in the next few months. So given all these trajectories, a nice clean model is helpful. The one on the left, A, is helpful, but the reality is there are a lot of institutions that kind of screw things up. So you have these economic rigidities that are coming up. So we're going to talk about what the economic rigidities in the supply chain in food look like today. You also have constraints on regulations. So what you actually can do is unclear. Nobody's power is total. You can't like just walk in and change rules without understanding why the rule was there, what the rule is about in the first place. And we also, in a world where there are 94,000 regulations that influence any given value chain, it's next to impossible to know which ones are going to be the bottlenecks. So on top of these kind of constraints, you also have to think about compliance fatigue. So, is it possible that at some point people just get really tired of staying in their house? And, because of these constraints on what their, essential versus non-essential businesses are allowed to do, we're seeing that in Michigan already. So, for example, you have a couple cases that actually they ran in the news on the same day last week. The first one was about a meat packer that one of his employees came in, or the manager of the meat packing plant, his employee came in sick, said he didn't feel well, and he thought he maybe had COVID-19. The employer or the manager said, no, go back to work, and don't tell anybody. And so now there is this pocket or this explosion of COVID-19 cases in meatpacking plants or in that meatpacking plant in the Dakotas. At the same time, here in Michigan, so Glee Orchards outside of Hillsdale, Michigan, which is famous for Hillsdale College. So the owner, Mr. Glee, I forget his first name, he's decided to just continue operation. Even though he's not technically deemed essential, he's decided, you know what, if I close, I'm going to go out of business. So, if the authorities come, so be it. We're going to have that conversation and maybe pay a fine. So, there is this question here about compliance fatigue and how different people within the management structure of a company are going to respond to some of these cases. If you own your brewery, you're pretty dang concerned about shutting down. If you work at the brewery, well, that's a different concern. So, there are all these different problems that go into trying to create some kind of clean model. The other part of this, and so I threw this up the last time I was there at Creighton. is the Dunning-Kruger Effect. So there is this trade-off in confidence and competence, where, you know, when you start with having no knowledge of something, you recognize you have no knowledge. But as you gain a little bit of knowledge, you feel like you're 100% confident that you're just the best, even though you're not truly competent at that. And then there's this clear kind of valley of despair thing that happens where you realize that you're an idiot and you fall into this space. So I talked about, I think, sophos moros. So the word sophomore is actually, the derivation is educated moron. So you could think about this as kind of the sophomore effect. You know, so your second year in college, you think you know the world. I think we're seeing that a lot, in part because we don't have much of a playbook to build much of this modeling off of. So, you know, if you want to read a book, actually, so John Barry's Great Influenza is the famous one. And that's the one that, like, you'll probably see on social media, that George W. Bush read this in 2005, and it freaked him out so much that he, like, developed this whole pandemic response team, and there was all this stuff that happened mostly because he read this book. But this was 1918. You know, we didn't have the same type of globalized food chains that we have now. People lived on farms. A lot of people lived on farms. Today, less than 1% of Americans work directly in agriculture. So even our best shot at understanding what all this looks like is 100 years old. And on top of that, just I might mention that this book talks about all the social distancing stuff that we're doing now. They did then too. So this isn't what we're doing. Actually, has been done, and there is a fair amount of legal precedent that supports it. It feels crazy, but I mean, it's not the first time. Okay, so there is the public health concerns, and you know, I back to my kind of educated moron stance. I don't really think I have enough knowledge to understand or to explain a lot of the public health concerns. But what I can feel fairly confident about, so I've gone through my valley of despair, but I'm starting to learn my limitations and understand what I can and can't say on food and ag markets. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. You know, I'm more than willing to field questions as best as I can. Okay, so this is for the Nebraska folks on the call. This is the thing that I bet a lot of people are talking about. So this is a change in grain futures prices as of a few days ago. If you're looking for good content, by the way, on what is happening in commodity marketing right now, I would very strongly recommend you follow FarmDoc. FarmDoc is a product out of Illinois, but they are the flagship land grain institution. I would call FarmDoc almost an institution at this point, in the way that they have kind of institutional knowledge of commodity marketing. So this is kind of an interesting breakdown. If you'll notice, wheat has remained fairly stable. Corn and soybeans have dropped off a cliff pretty badly, and that we'll get into maybe why that is the case. Corn is especially an interesting one. Soybeans has already been kind of in the crosshairs of a lot of conversations, but am I supposed to be following the chat? No. Okay. Okay, so this is what's happening to corn and soybeans. Part of the reason that corn is dropping off as bad is the same thing that I think everybody saw in the news just a couple days ago. So crude has plummeted, and oil prices have just fallen off a cliff, literally. I mean, look at that drop for May futures. It's just absolutely shocking. You know, we dropped below, you know, $30 a barrel, or negative $30 a barrel the other day. But what that means is, you know, for a lot of the corn crop in the United States, they rely on ethanol demand. And when crude prices or futures prices for crude are in the negative 30 range, what's happening is that a lot of the ethanol manufacturers are literally just not operating now. So you had this massive amount of demand that is completely gone, which is pretty scary for corn, honestly. So as of right now, as of the surveys that I saw yesterday, we're a little bit behind on corn planting. So I think 6% of the corn crop in the United States is planted. But you would anticipate that increases dramatically here in the next few weeks. Unfortunately, that's also the same time that I think, at least the models suggest, that a lot of the more rural places might also experience kind of a pretty large shock in coronavirus cases. So we'll have to see how that all plays out. This is more on this kind of ethanol conversation. So this is average corn prices in 2019 against the 5-year average, and then 2020. So if you'll notice here, so ethanol prices in the Eastern Corn Belt were fairly consistent with the averages back in 2019 and the 5-year average. Look at that 2020 number though. I mean, everything's just falling off a cliff. And so this really matters, not just for how much your gas is going to cost, but it matters for farmers more than you might realize. I mean, again, this is something that's amazing about supply chains. Because of this, we're now seeing a decrease in available CO2 on the market. And that CO2 is important for brewers and for other restaurant managers while they try to maintain their supply. So, these things are way more interchanged. For anybody that's ever read iPencil, we're seeing iPencil play out in real time. I mean, you think you pull one string and the whole thing unravels. So we're learning as we go here. Again, here's just more, the S&P is something that was getting a lot of attention for a while there. Prices are dropping again, just a shocking amount in terms of percent changes. One thing that I do want to highlight is volatility. Okay, so I at least at the beginning of all this, we had just an incredible amount of volatility on the stock market. If you're really wanting to follow a number that I think is probably more interesting than the Dow or the S&P at this point, it's the VIX, the Volatility Index, because that Volatility Index is telling you that there's just all kinds of action that's happening. And where you see that kind of in normal times, high volatility would reach maybe somewhere around 30. We're sitting at 45 right now, and that's not nearly as high as it got about a month ago. So that volatility alone tells you that there's a lot of uncertainty that's playing out in the market. There's a lot of trading happening because people think they might be able to gain some type of kind of economic advantage in the stock market. So here's an article from almost a month ago now in the New York Times. He says, I was a disciplined investor for over 40 years. Virus broke me in 40 days. And that's because of this volatility that I'm talking about. It's not just the sell-offs, it's the craziness. Okay, so that also translates in terms of volatility to kind of commodities futures prices in general. So I've already talked about the Corn Belt because I mean you're Cornhusker state, but this has implications for basically any type of ag product right now. So ethanol is the one that really has fallen off. So class 4 milk. This is cumulative percent change in futures prices. So class 4 milk is plummeting. Class 3 milk, I don't know if anybody can guess why that's happening. If you go to the grocery store, you see that there's, all of this, maybe there's even constraints on how much dairy you can buy. But you also read stories that they're dumping milk, right? So the reason that that's happening is because you have effectively two supply chains. You have the consumer supply chain that goes to the grocery store, and then you have this institutional supply chain. And one of the big institutional players in milk is schools. So as soon as we started shutting down elementary schools and high schools and all of these other schools, that institutional demand, while they're still providing lunches, it's not that they're not providing lunches, it's that they're not providing sales at the same level for the institution of schools. Cafeteria sales is obviously way down. So that's what's happening to milk, which is kind of incredible. Hogs is another one that, hogs are really fascinating. I don't remember if I've got it. We'll get to hogs in a minute. Back to the stock market. So company valuations are falling out in a really interesting, I think, pattern. So the big bold line is the S&P 500. So it's probably worth measuring these differences against that S&P because, so the Dow is really a garbage measure in terms of trying to understand the kind of the current economy. S&P is a little bit better. So notice that the grocery stores are relative to the S&P doing okay. Packaged food sales are also kind of stable. And this was like early April, so I mean things are changing all the time. Discount stores, we're getting a little closer. Premium brands are tracking with the S&P more or less. Restaurants are the ones that are going to start seeing some of that drop off. The big players, which are the ones that trade on the stock exchange, they're still somewhat okay. So I would anticipate that if we're trying to talk valuations of independent restaurants, they're going to be off the chart to the bottom. But the big loser right now is the institutional food players. So Cisco, Amarok, these places that are selling almost exclusively to like Creighton's cafeteria, you know, and so that demand is gone. And so you know, trying to understand how these players are going to survive the next few months is going to be an interesting conversation. Okay, so this is all, I'm talking so far about what's going on here in the US and specifically in the markets, the stock markets. But there has also been a lot of movement on international trade. So it's important to remember that the US is a net exporter of agricultural products. Okay, so we actually sell more in terms of total value than we import. Now, that is not true for all products. It's food imports are very import specific. So horticulture has been the kind of big loser in terms of kind of trade balance from 2000 to 2018. Our kind of livestock imports have been fairly stable over that same period of time. Sugar has seen a little bit of an increase, but as you can see, horticulture products are the big one. Now, the reason that is, in large part, if I was kind of make a simple conjecture, is labor costs. So those labor costs have kind of increased relative to other places as the cost to trade has decreased. But so regardless, remember, we export a lot of food. Now remember, we are very connected and tied into the international food supply chain. Okay, even within those import categories, you have very large differences across product-specific groups. So coffee, cocoa, spices, fish and shellfish, that is, in terms of US food consumption, those things are almost entirely dominated by imports. Now, fresh fruits and juices, that's about 50-50. We do a lot of that here in Michigan. So the Trump tweet the other day about immigration policy was terrifying to producers here because we produce a lot of fresh fruits and juices and we rely on migrant labor to do so. Now, you know, moving back down to, you know, sugar and wine and everything else, the drop off is pretty significant. Now, the reason that matters is because over the last month or so, more and more countries have decided to kind of flee into protectionism mode. And so this is data from the IFPRI export tracker. I'm happy to send you the link if you want. But I threw this figure together. Basically, what it's saying is that countries, more and more countries across the world are starting to implement export restrictions on what their producers can sell overseas. Now, there have always been trade restrictions in the world, right? Like, I mean, that's a thing that people have done forever. What's interesting about this is it's a little bit more rare for a country to say, hey, you as a citizen can't go make money selling your product somewhere. You have to keep it here. You know, usually the trade restrictions, like the tariffs, I get they're confusing, but like they're implemented on somebody else's stuff. Where this case is people implementing trade restrictions on their own stuff. And so this is something that I think is very much worth watching if you're looking for international trade, particularly because I think we're going to see more and more of this. So this is some numbers from Bloomberg. The WTO is kind of making some projections. Honestly, data sources are not set up to be as real time as we need right now. So, you know, they're trying to give you some type of, you know, optimistic or pessimistic scenario, but the projections can get worse than 30% drop in terms of, you know, annual change in volume of world merchandise trade. So we're looking at what could be a historic moment in terms of declines of just global trade in general. But you know, I get it. Like these are big picture things. I think it's good for us to also cover what's happening in grocery stores, because that's what we're all seeing. You know, I mean, for as much as I can talk about restaurants, even, you know, I would imagine most of you aren't probably going to restaurants very often right now. I would recommend that you do. As I mentioned, there are kind of two supply chains. You know, the grocery store supply chain is obviously being pretty strained right now. There are a whole lot of restaurants that are willing to sell you food that they have kind of on hand right now. So the other day I called my favorite barbecue place, and I was like, you know, how long is it going to take for me to get a rack of ribs? And they said, oh, 10 minutes, you know. And so I went and picked up a full rack of ribs in 10 minutes. So, I mean, the food's still there. It's just that, you know, people are afraid to go. There is another aside. You actually are probably going to see fewer people at the restaurant than you would at the grocery store. So if you're trying to socially distance yourself, it almost might be better to go to the restaurant. And again, I'm not a public health expert, and I mean, that's a paper for somebody someday. But at least from my own experience, if I go pick up restaurant food, at max, I'm going to see 2 people. Maybe I'll just see the person who they put out front to handle the orders at that moment in time. But if I go to a grocery store, people everywhere. So food for thought. Okay, so the way that Americans have spent their money has changed dramatically. So fine dining, casual dining, fast casual, fast food has just plummeted. Delivery services have skyrocketed. You know, it's not surprising. It's probably what everybody out there is doing already. And if you might notice, delivery services are way backed up. And those guys are really on the front lines of this right now. So if you're using delivery services, please tip like crazy as best as you can and be nice. You know, I mean, I've heard enough stories about people not being nice to their delivery guys to say like you're very privileged to be able to sit in your house, you know, and make sure that you're kind of considering other people. You know, be a Jesuit here and try to be a contemplative in action. So the way that people move as they purchase things has also changed. Okay, so this is data. It's kind of scary data that they even have it, but your cell phone is tracking where you go all the time. And because we have that data, we can track foot traffic in stores. And so this is data of foot traffic in 4 different grocery store outlets. Okay, so this is 7-day rolling averages. So, you know, again, data sources are not really set up to do this real-time analysis the way that we would like. But notice, and some of you might have even done this, middle of March, people panicked, and that foot traffic in Aldi and grocery stores and Trader Joe's, it increased pretty significantly relative to last year. But now we've seen this come down, and foot traffic has declined like crazy. You know, I think there are probably some interesting conjectures you can make as to why Aldi and average grocery stores have not seen the drop the same way that you see in Trader Joe's and Whole Foods. You know, there might be some privilege to that, but I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting conversation that again is a great paper someday. Here the data is for grocery stores versus Walmart versus Costco versus Target. I don't really understand the whole Walmart versus Target thing. Like, it's not clear to me why there's such a difference between those 2 places. You know, maybe there's just differences in the types of people that shop at the 2 places. Maybe it's locations, right? So Target tries to locate in more urban centers, and Walmart tends to be more on the outskirts of communities and cities. So I don't know, still interesting that you see, again, the big spike or at least some type of increase followed by a decrease. McDonald's and Starbucks, even the McDonald's and Starbucks of the world are seeing a drop in foot traffic or in traffic in general. So even the big players are seeing a decrease. Here is some data from IRI scanner data in terms of sales growth for deli departments. So this is a comparable week in 2019 versus now. Again, as you see, the bakery aisle, cookies and crackers, and in-store bakery sales increased. In-store bakery sales, not so much as the bakery aisle and the cookies and crackers aisle, but we've seen that start to plateau as well. Again, so now thinking about meats. So fresh meats or edibles excluding fresh meats, if we're looking at, meats, bakeries, dairy, deli, foods, again, notice this hump where people were kind of stocking up, and notice the kind of plateau, which in terms of food access, that plateau is really comforting to see, because that means that the supply chains are going to be able to catch up. Basically, if you think about how these grocery store supply chains work, they actually are pretty dang accurate at predicting what you're probably going to buy in April, in a normal April. And that's why they always have the things on the shelves, but not too many things on the shelves. But this was a whole different type of April, like I've already said. So it's just different. I mentioned that I was going to get to hogs a little bit, and you could do a whole hour, you could do a whole book on hogs right now. But this is one that I think is kind of an interesting story. Oh, sorry, not hogs, but also chickens. So poultry and hogs are doing similar things. On hogs, so bacon prices are dropping. So futures prices on bacon, because most of the bacon we eat is consumed at restaurants. And so, you have these like different packages of bacon that go to restaurants than the packages that you buy at the grocery store. And so that transition has been fairly rough. The same thing is happening with chicken wings, except for that there's a demand side story here that's even deeper than the restaurant sales. So because we eat a ton of chicken wings around March Madness, basically the supply chains anticipate that every year. They already know that it's coming, and so they are producing to set up for sales of March Madness. And then all of a sudden March Madness doesn't happen, and guess what happens to chicken wing sales? Look at that drop. It's just really shocking to see how quickly we moved from 1.2 million pounds of wings sold in the United States to 433,000. And the prices have tracked right along with that. And that's chicken wings, but we could tell a different story throughout these supply chains across the board. Ag and food is a very complicated web. Okay, so now we get into the kind of weird nitty-gritty part of this stuff too. So Busch Beer is doing this kind of sweepstakes right now where, if you had a wedding planned and then your wedding has been put on hold, if you tweet out, they might give you a year's worth of Busch lattes. The weird thing is we now have these kind of executive orders that kind of make it questionable as to whether or not you can do this. Because, so this is from Michigan. This is Michigan's Executive Order 2020-42. It says that, stores of more than 50,000 square feet can't promote goods that aren't kind of so promoting this. So if Kroger started tweeting this out in Michigan, there's a weird gray area here as to whether or not you can actually promote Busch Beer. I don't know. The enforcement would probably be unlikely, but we have interesting gray areas that I don't think we would have thought about before in food. This is something that I've been tracking as closely as I can while also trying to do a million other things. So this is the data from a USA Today op-ed that we wrote, or that I wrote, that ran this morning on brewers across the U.S. So this is from a survey of breweries. So brewery staff were laid off and or furloughed. 66% of the staff were laid off and or furloughed. A lot of those, or most of those, were part-timers, but half the full-time staff at these places, and 60% of full-time equivalent workers at breweries are on furlough right now. The fear is that, we're talking about over half the breweries in the United States that are afraid they're going to have to close here in the next 2 months, which is a pretty striking number. And the reason that is, honestly, is because the on-premise sales have just dried up. You can't drink on-premise, and most of the breweries that have opened in the United States in the last 6-7 years have been almost exclusively on-premises sales. And so, if they can't sell that way, which is how they built their business model, how else can they reach their consumers? And that's where, opening up self-distribution as much as possible is It's not going to save them all, but it's going to help them at least have a fighting chance to kind of regain some of that market share that they've lost. But you do, like I said, you see stories everywhere. So, you know, Business Insider, wow, almost a month ago now, is predicting 110,000 restaurants. The Restaurant Association is throwing out those kinds of numbers are going to close in the United States. You know, the way that maybe some of these restaurants might be able to pivot has been kind of taken from them by regulators. So there are different state and city governments that are basically not allowing restaurants to sell their goods as kind of groceries because they don't have the grocery permit. So Reason has done a fairly good job of kind of covering those things and kind of raising awareness. So there are a bunch of articles there. You know, the places that have been able to shift, I think has been very promising. Toilet paper is one that is also in this space. So I'm sure everybody saw the toilet paper hoarding jokes and everything at the beginning of this. It's not just hoarding. It might have been a little hoarding, and some people were probably hoarding, but there's actually a pretty clean economic explanation of this too. And that economic implication or that economic discussion is all about where you go to the bathroom on a daily basis. You might not think about it, but if you work, odds are you're probably going to the bathroom and using the work bathroom toilet paper a lot, and you don't realize it. And think about how different the toilet paper is at work than the toilet paper is at your house. And because, like, think about even the size of the rolls. It wouldn't even fit at your house, and it's single ply, and it's terrible toilet paper, but we use it because we're at work. Well, Michigan State University has a whole lot of toilet paper right now that nobody's using that they had planned for. And so, you know, where everybody shifted their bathroom location, that supply chain can't shift as easily because they're literally two different products. And so, I mean, that's the same story across the board. So, you know, these institutional players still have access to a lot of the goods if you're feeling like you don't have access. It's just that it's just not going to be the same packaging as what you're used to. Again, just more stories about this, about trying to figure out what regulations are really constraining people. So alcohol to go is a big push right now. That's kind of what my USA Today article was about. Now, somebody did rightfully point out that, so in the early cut of my editorial, I wrote that people are moving. So Pennsylvania banned the sale of liquor and wine at their liquor stores because they're government owned. And so there's all these stories about people going over state lines to buy their alcohol. In my first cut, I wrote alcohol sales are moving across the border, but they changed it to beer sales for consistency. They actually can sell at beer stores beer in Pennsylvania. But I will say that regardless of that reality, the fact that people are driving to Pennsylvania to pick up their alcohol, it makes it really hard for me to believe that they're going to make second trips. So regardless of whether or not you can technically buy beer in Pennsylvania, that shift towards liquor stores in other states is still going to decrease sales of beer in Pennsylvania. So just throwing it out there, things get really complicated quickly in any type of food supply chain because people are very concerned about what they eat and what they put in their bodies. And so regulations follow. So what we're doing on the regulatory side in the United States is trying to relax rules. So FDA is relaxing rules on egg labeling to address surging retail demand. I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so I've talked about what you're seeing. I talked about markets. I talked about international trade. The last comment that I get a lot if I'm going to give a talk is, okay, so you're an ag economist. Why are you talking about stock brokers and you're talking about, you know, the restaurant industry and everything? What about farmers? You know, people even in economics think that I basically just talk to farmers all day. So what's going on with farmers right now? Well, it depends. Okay, so here's what I thought was a very nice data representation of the workers who face the greatest coronavirus risk. Okay, so farmers are not just people who are sitting in their tractors and not interacting with anybody. The ag and food supply chain from top to bottom has, you know, fundamentally different interactions and relationships with people and social interaction, the growers with the kind of least likely exposure to diseases are kind of these crop nursery and greenhouse farm workers. But as we move forward, farm equipment mechanics and service technicians have a higher likelihood of being exposed to diseases. This is kind of scary because in a lot of places in kind of rural America, especially with kind of the push towards new technology and precision ag, there aren't that many people within a 100 square mile radius who know how to work on a John Deere tractor. And so if you do have some type of infection, so notice that the size of that the size of that group is only like 34,000 people, but that's a very specialized group of people. And so it's a small group, but knocking out even half of that group, which would only be according to case rates, that would only be 20,000 people. But that would do a lot of damage to the ag economy. As we move toward farm workers, farm ranch, and aquacultural animals, we see a higher exposure to diseases and a larger physical proximity even still. So, again, look at the employment numbers here and notice that the total number of employment is not massive, but these are very specialized jobs. And so you can't say, well, what is it, like 12% of Americans in the United States have filed for unemployment in the last 4 weeks? Why don't they go work on farm? Well, it's not that simple. It's not like you can just walk out in the field and start picking blueberries even, because I mean, frankly, you're not going to be very good at it. It takes a long time to be good at picking blueberries, even though it doesn't seem like it should be true that way. Have you ever been to an apple orchard, and tried to pick an apple, and then a bunch of apples fall off the tree? Well, you just cost that farmer a lot of money, and it's because you don't know how to pick apples. So it's not as easy as it sounds, and that's specialty crops. That's where labor-intensive stuff is I mean, pretty normal. Think about trying to repair your own car at this point, and then make it an $800,000 car with precision technology that can self-drive. This is very specialized labor, which is why I think we've seen a pretty big fall off in terms of kind of future expectations of growers. So this is from the Purdue University Center for Commercial Ag Producer Survey. This is March data, so obviously we're waiting to see the April data. But this is kind of an index value of what growers think the future or current conditions will look like. So everybody was riding pretty high there at the beginning of 2020. But if you'll notice, the index of future expectations in February was 175, and it's dropped to 126 in a month. And I have a hard time believing that number is going to increase anytime soon. So we'll see what the numbers look like this month, but it's going to continue, I bet. Growers are worried. There were 20-something%, so 26% of growers that said they weren't too worried or not at all worried about coronavirus's effect on their profitability in March. There is no way that number is not 100% now in the fairly worried or very worried category. But even mid-March, this was a concern for growers. So people expected also price expectations on farmland to be affected. So the red line here is the percent of respondents who believe that their farmland prices are going to decrease. Look at that spike there. So within a month, we've seen a lot of concern as it relates to prices on assets. And part of it is that it's not just the farmer, we have a supply chain, right? So we have, this is daily cattle slaughter. So in 2019, things were fairly stable. You saw kind of this cyclical trend. In 2020, I mean, look at the estimates of daily cattle slaughter. So this is a Jason Lusk calculation. So he's using USDA data to kind of make an estimate. Again, our data sources are just not set up for this. But the best estimates right now is that we're seeing slaughter fall off a cliff. And so you're going to see a lot of editorials and a lot of conversations on Facebook and social media and everything about how it's the beef packers that are controlling all of this, and it's the evil beef packers that are basically price gouging consumers while at the same time offering bottom dollar prices for meat. So there's a bigger story at play here, and a lot of it has to do with institutional demand. And this cattle slaughter number is, I think, a pretty telling thing that you've seen this decrease in demand for your beef cows. Similar story in pork, by the way. Pork prices plummeting. So this is back to my bacon story. So pork, this is wholesale daily pork prices, they're plummeting. Eggs are interesting. So eggs, this is the National Shell Egg Price Report, a couple days old now. But if you'll notice, we saw a massive spike in wholesale prices for eggs, shell eggs. Again, goes back to that story I was telling, where in March you saw an explosion of demand, and that explosion is starting to go away. Now we're seeing wholesale prices, at least in the national level, start to come back down to the prices that we would expect. Now that is in part, I think, a regulatory story, and we're working on a paper about that. That gets back to what I said about the USDA providing some flexibility between wholesale purchasers on different sides. So, restaurants are buying different packaging of eggs, and at least before all of this happened, a restaurant wasn't technically allowed to sell that package that they just bought as a grocery item. So that's shifted now. So we have this change. And I can't say that that's 100% what's doing this to wholesale prices, but it coincides pretty nicely. It's going to take a pretty nice, clean identification strategy to get at the total size. But hard to imagine that it's not a little bit. Which leads me to my policy question. This is the known unknown. We don't know what policy looks like in this this current and post COVID-19 world. So you're seeing articles and you're seeing pushes on beef. I already told you kind of a little bit of a story on beef. You're going to see more and more and more and more of that conversation if you're in kind of ag media. There was already a lot of frustration. So I was in a Washington Post article 6 months ago talking about how angry people are or were about the market facilitation payment program, sending money to JBS, which is a Brazilian company. So there was already some anger, and this anger, I think, is reaching a bubbling point right now. So, okay, I'm telling a lot of stories, but I also want to highlight, notice the dates of all the things that I'm telling you. So this is March 26th, this is April 2nd, March 31st. We're doing our best to keep up with data, but even the stories that these guys are writing, they don't come out the same day that they wrote the story. And so things are changing so rapidly that my best advice is to try to follow very reputable sources on social media like Twitter. Twitter is scary because you can fall into some kind of weird holes in Twitter. But there are, on the ag and food side, because of this land grant mission, there are people who really focus very hard on trying to, generate content that is trustworthy. So Glenn Tonzer on the livestock side is if you're not following him, you really should, for livestock questions. So Jason Lusk is kind of one of the famous ones. He was my advisor, and I actually stole some of this content from his work. Scott Irwin, if you're looking for kind of row crops, so wheat, corn, soybeans, he's kind of the guy. Like I said, he's a part of FarmDoc, and FarmDoc is doing really good stuff. They're doing webinars every other day, I think, or maybe it's Tuesday, Fridays. So John Newton is the chief economist at Farm Bureau. He's been making a lot of really handy data visualization of kind of ag stuff. And I get that there's a lot of people out there making data graphics, but at least he's a part of, or he understands kind of the industry nuances here. So following his take on futures prices or his infographics on futures prices is probably going to help you avoid kind of reposting something that at least isn't vetted by somebody in the industry world. My shameless self-plug is you can follow me too. You don't have to, but it really depends on what you're wanting to see in terms of content. But there are, because of this land grant system that we have in the United States, we actually do have some type of infrastructure that's trying to get nonpartisan information out there. I mean, people are putting out like crazy sport information. Bridget Behe has been doing a great job with a podcast that I've helped her with a bit called Connect to Consumer. So if you want to know what's going on and how floriculture, kind of small garden shops are handling all of this stuff, Connect to Consumer is a really good spot. Farm to Market is a product from Daryl Peel. Daryl Peel is probably, well, like when Planet Money wants to get a livestock economist to talk about beef cows, that's the guy they call. So Farm to Market is good. Agmanager.info is fantastic. That's out of K-State. They're also following this stuff with a little bit heavier influence or emphasis on beef cows. And for those of you that are in Nebraska, you're probably already very familiar with the Nebraska connection to K-State. So, you know, it's very good stuff. You know, so Shaffer and I, my colleague, like I said, we do this thing called Closing Bell. And it's, while everybody else is kind of building a webinar model, kind of like what I'm doing here, our take is more of kind of a discussion format. So, I mean, I think people want to have a straight answer from economists, and we're just not built for that. So what we basically do is we field questions all week from people, and then we kind of have some structure as to how the argument is going to go, but then we argue about those questions. And you know, sometimes I end up on sides of arguments that I would have never thought that I would. But my take, and kind of from a listener perspective, what's nice is you're hearing people with at least some type of industry knowledge argue through some very complicated topics. And so instead of reading like a 700-word whatever, or watching a 1-minute video that isn't going to help you kind of understand the nuance, we're trying to give you the behind the curtains perspective on what's going on and what our take is. It's also, I think, a little bit fun to listen to. I drink the whole time, so I have a beer in hand, and I think most of the listeners do too. By Fridays, I think we all need drinks. So, you know, it's something that's a resource if you're interested. Totally fine if you're not either. Well, that's all I've got prepared. I think I was shooting for 45 and I went 55, so sorry about that. But open for questions if anybody wants to ask something.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So, you know, hearing you talk about regulation, kind of making things a little bit more difficult, I'm wondering, it seems like the responses to the crisis have been mostly at the state level. So in Michigan, everything is really restrictive. Other places, it's not as bad. Tennessee is about to open back up. I know that in Nebraska, they changed the laws to allow people to have carry-out cocktails, for example. Are you aware of anybody kind of keeping track of the different responses at the state level and how that might, you know, hamper or facilitate people kind of returning to normal? Because it seems like, you know, as we try to adjust to this new world and having greater social distance overall, what you need is really kind of a nimble economy, right? This is an Austrian point, right? It's trying to reallocate the resources to slightly different uses because, you know, we don't go to restaurants and buy all our food and then make it at home. So, you know, it seems like the states that would do best in this scenario are the ones that would deregulate significantly and allow people to kind of about their business in a slightly different way if they want to. Are you aware of anybody kind of keeping track of regulations changing at the state level?
I would love to see somebody just maintain like a regulation restriction database or something like that of like, or flexibility database or something. Because I mean, this stuff is happening in such real time. So like my USA Today article ran this morning, and I think yesterday, Pennsylvania is now allowing drive-up liquor sales. So like, you know, this stuff is so fast. And you're right that a lot of this is happening at the state level, which makes it even more complicated because now you have like truly 50 factories trying to figure out what policy looks like. But you know, there is some flexibility that's happening in the federal level as well. So on ag, the two big ones. So I mentioned the egg thing that the USDA is kind of behind, and the FDA. But then another kind of big one is the H-2A visa program. So in the United States, migrant labor is, I mean, literally the backbone of how we produce food in the United States. So there was a lot of concern associated with what this does to migrant labor, especially as it relates to the H-2A visa program. And so a week or two ago, the H-2A visa program has rolled out a handful of kind of flexible changes that I think everybody freaked out 2 days ago when all of a sudden Trump tweeted about like closing immigration, because I mean, just 2 weeks ago, they had walked back these H-2A restrictions. But even though that's true, so the Wall Street Journal rightly yesterday published an article that said that no, the H-2A program is still okay. The flexibility is been maintained. But my point is just, this is so dynamic that like I would almost love to have just like a grad student whose whole research assistantship right now is just focusing on trying to follow these flexibilities. Because in the short term, it's good to know. In the long term, it will be great to understand exactly what the effect of these flexibilities or the increase in nimble economies has done to kind of the ability for businesses to write out these kind of gargantuan closure numbers. That would be an awesome paper, but I don't have a grad student that can do that right now.
Well, cool. I think that we've got a really thorough kind of overview of the kind of ag and food industry. This was a fantastic presentation, Trey. Thank you so much for coming on here and enlightening us with all of this. And I'm sure that this will spark some type of research projects for our students. So if it's okay with you, we're probably going to share this discussion
Sure.
With at least our students, so that they can check out, especially those that weren't able to make it here on time, as we're all at different times now. But
well,
yeah,
if you have an undergrad of your students who are interested in doing some research, there's a thing I would love to work with you guys on is one like a nimbleness tracker or something like what have been the flexibilities that have been implemented in different places to try to prevent some of these business closures. If you have any undergrads out there that are interested in that topic, that sounds like a super cool, like a senior capstone kind of thing.
Yeah.
So just a thought.
Agreed. We'll talk about this and maybe push this into the summer, especially since we're all asynchronous. This will be a great summer project for an undergrad and even for one of us. So yeah, I think we'll cut it off there. We'll wrap things up. Thanks again, Trey, so much for joining us and sharing with us your insights. This was a fantastic talk. Well, I feel like I know so much more. I'm at the top of that Dunning-Kruger point now, so I better watch what I say on Facebook. But yeah, thank you so much. I hope you have a great day, and thank you all for joining us with this virtual discussion. And I hope you all have a fantastic rest of the day. Thanks again.
Thank you guys. Appreciate the invite.